like one who, on a lonely road, doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round, walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. Greetings, comrades, and mostly enemies. Hey guys, got something a little bit different, a little bit more serious than anything we've done up until now. I wanted to do a literary discussion of sorts of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, as she titled it. Gonna be a little bit more serious this video because personally I think the subject matter merits it. I mean, this is a serious literary work in my opinion. I am a fairly literate person when it comes to grasp of language and reading comprehension and vocabulary and all that stuff, and it was an intellectual challenge. Like it's a thinking piece, to be sure. So I'd like to give it some serious discussion, and we are going to dive into this thing head first. So first, I want to give a summary of kind of the, kind of frame this whole book. This thing came out, if I remember correctly, 1818. That's when Mary Shelley wrote it, and I believe it came out shortly after. And it's not only is it, written in the era of romance, but I believe she intended it to be a romance-style novel. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, there's a difference between a romance era novel and a modern contemporary romance novel. I dare say they're unrelated. And I can best illustrate the difference with this simple analogy that I wrote. I call this the flower field analogy. Contemporary writing or a contemporary romance novel. Character A says, "This field of flowers is beautiful, majestic even. Thanks for bringing me." Romance era character says, "As I gaze upon the majestic nature, the effulgence of so many flowers and creatures as they waft gently in the breeze or run about peacefully, I cannot truly express the quiet joy and unrestrained luminescence of my being. As these feelings pour over me, flowing into my mind through the windows of my soul, I cannot help but be infinitely grateful to you, my friend, for you have graced me with a memory that will last a lifetime, preserving me in darkness and rousing my spirit in times of strife. Alas! Let our mien and countenance reflect our boundless joy as we celebrate with resplendent mirth." See the difference? Now you have an idea about what romance era writing was like. It was all like that. I mean, Mary Shelley's entire book is like that. So obviously, by today's standards, for a lot of people, it's going to be a dull read, and it's going to take either severe interest in the story or an interest in that kind of writing to get through it. I personally have a bit of a enjoyment of that kind of writing, especially when it's done well. And to give you a little bit of idea, I can't stand Shakespeare. I've read a few things from Shakespeare. I think his stuff is crap. I think Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a masterpiece. So take that as you will. That bit of framing of historical nature in place, let's actually start talking about the book proper. We open up and we are not introduced initially to any of the main characters. We're actually introduced to this guy, Walton. And we are introduced through letters he's writing to his sister. And this is probably the most tedious part of the book, is the opening letters. But we're hearing about this guy Walton's life and his aspirations to do a scientific journey to the North Pole to study the magnetic currents and other things of that nature. Finally, after Walton is all done telling us about the crew he assembles and his efforts to procure a vessel to go up north, we finally get to the sailing trip, and we are first introduced to the Doctor as he's pursuing his monster across the ice fields of the North Pole. So we briefly see the monster, and then we see the Doc, who is floating on a chunk of ice, and he's pulled aboard by Walton and his crew. And over the course of the next few days, Walton and the Doctor strike up a friendship, and the Doctor begins to tell Walton about his life. And so the entire book is framed in the device of Walton copying down Dr. Frankenstein's story as it's relayed to him. After we finally start hearing Frankenstein's story, we still don't get to the action. We hear a bunch about his childhood, we hear a bunch about his parents, and he introduces us to this girl Elizabeth, who ends up being Dr. Frankenstein's bride later on. And we do all this romantic world building, talking about how his family is affluent and well-traveled, and so is he. And it talks about his early interest in the philosophers and alchemists of yesteryear, and he gives specific names and specific books that he took interest in that gave him an interest in the elixir of life. And it's all, building up to his interest in science. So he goes later on to university, right? And this is where we finally start getting close to the inciting event. He also, while studying at the university, studies dead bodies from graves. And this is something that isn't explicitly talked about in the text very much, probably because Mary Shelley didn't want to gross out her audience, because that was still kind of a very taboo thing back then. During this time of studying books and studying corpses, and he figures it out. He figures out the secret, and she doesn't elaborate on it. She doesn't give any insight into what it might be. She just says he figures out the secret to animating what is inanimate. And it's actually pretty closely said that way. He starts putting together a lab, and he starts putting together his monster. Now, something I want to note, which I found very interesting, nowhere in the text is it explicitly stated that Dr. Frankenstein's monster is made out of various dead bodies. It's never explicitly stated. It's only slightly implied. More of that later. And I'm going to quickly read you this little section right here from when he's actually making the monster, because we've seen this on screen like 100 times, and I think you might be interested / enjoy hearing the actual description from the source material about when Frankenstein brought his monster to life. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain patted dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out. When the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. So, from that we see that the Doc didn't have an assistant. There was no lightning. They really take a lot of liberties on screen. We don't see any of that stuff. We know he had some scientific instruments around, and he somehow brought a monster to life. It's very vague. So that's probably why Hollywood has gone so buck wild with its interpretation, because it's so vague you can do almost anything with it. I just thought that was interesting. So finally, he makes his monster. When his monster finally wakes up, he sees it's an abomination. The thing is huge, it's pale, it's got black lips, yellow eyes, his face is all deformed. He's described as being profoundly hideous. His ugliness is so profound, people look at him and have physical, violent reactions. I mean, like, eldritch horror level ugliness here. So that's what Mary Shelley tries to impress upon us. And so the Doctor flees from his creation, and he returns to his lab later to find the thing gone. And foolishly, like an idiot, he thought, oh, my problems are gone. Oh, thank God. And from that point on, he goes about his life until finally he gets letters from home after this long recovery period where he is recovering from his dauntless studying and making that monster, or because he basically wasn't sleeping or eating, crazy scientist stuff. So his friend comes into town, says, hey man, you're sick, let me help you out. He gets a letter from home, and he finds out that his little brother is dead. So he's like, I gotta go home. So he starts going home, and when he gets there, he sees the monster, and he's like, 1, 2, make 3. He is thrown into this horrible depression, and he's really glum. Goes on this journey of self-reflection, and he's trying to figure out where he went wrong, and I was only doing this to help humanity, and now I've created a monster, and woe is me. And here's why I gave you that romance era writing example early on, so that I could reference it to demonstrate just how much time and effort Mary Shelley put into talking about the emotions of the characters. She spends, I dare say, like 50,000 words in this book, and it's only 70,000 words, something like that total. She spends like 50,000 of that length describing emotions and how people feel, and trying to impress upon you the state of mind and the state of their soul. And so we have a very good idea of just how torn up the Doctor is about all this. And he goes on a little journey, and he goes out of town to clear his head. And it's worth noting that despite the fact that his brother just got killed a couple months ago, being out in nature, he regarded nature with such awe that being out in nature in and of itself started making him feel better. He climbs up a mountain, and he's confronted by the monster again. And the monster makes a case to him. So after the monster confronts him on these ice fields up in the mountains, they go to a remote cottage, and they sit by a fire, and the monster starts retelling his story since he escaped the lab to the Doctor. And we spend chapters 11 through 15 with the monster, seeing what he did. He talks about how he foraged in the wilds, and he gradually came to his senses, learning to perceive the world and use his body, and how he subsisted off berries, and found a fire that was left by roaming beggars, and collected odds and ends. And finally, he comes to stay at this cottage. After getting chased out of a town or two, he comes to stay behind this cottage, stacks a bunch of wood and debris against the back of it, and makes a little hovel for himself near the chimney so that he can survive the winter cold. And here he spends months getting to know the family that lives inside the cottage through observation, because they never see him until way later, because they'd run in fear. So he gets to know them through listening and looking through cracks in their little wall. And he comes to love these people. He comes to say, these are my protectors. He actually uses that word a lot to describe the people that live in the cottage. And eventually, he resolves to introduce himself to these people. So he does that, and it does not go well. So they run off, and he's alone again. And that is when the monster resolved to go to the Doctor. He wandered across the European countryside until he got an idea of where it was going, and headed to, Geneva, where the Doctor lived. And then he came across the Doctor's brother and found out the kid was the Doctor's brother and choked him to death. The reason the monster confronted the Doctor in the first place was to appeal to him to make him a bride. Oh, and when I was reading through, I was actually wondering if the Bride of Frankenstein bit was a creation of Hollywood. I was kind of happy to see that it wasn't. So the doctor initially refuses, and we end up going on this whole journey with the doctor as he leaves the household of his family to go and make this thing somewhere away from their prying eyes. So he ends up going to Scotland, and in Scotland he goes to this remote island with 5 people. Remember that for later. Remote island, 5 people. It's actually, the number is given, 5 people on this island. He starts making this monster with his instruments. And now his original monster shows up some point during the process, and the doc, on seeing him again, has a change of heart, and he's like, no, I can't create another one of these things. It's too horrible. He already murdered my brother. These things are evil. I can't create another one. So he destroys the Bride of Frankenstein in front of his he destroys the bride of his monster in front of the monster. Drives the monster nuts. Monster goes off, kills one of the doc's best friends, does his best to frame the doc for it. The doc spends some time in prison. Finally, his dad comes, bails him out, and they hightail it back to Geneva. At which point, the monster waits until the doc decides to get hitched to his longtime betrothed. Monster waits till their wedding night, kills Victor Frankenstein's bride. And that's the point where Victor finally had the bright idea, I should probably try to kill this thing. And that's when the epic chase that leads us all the way full circle back to the beginning of the book begins. And the doc begins chasing the monster down. Finally, at the very, very end of the book, we see that the doc takes ill and he can't continue his pursuit, and he ends up dying shipboard without ever being able to fulfill his goal of killing that monster. So, with that long, drawn-out, rambling summary of the book in place, I want to discuss some finer points, some ideas I had about the book. First, I'm halfway convinced the monster isn't real. And I've taken quite a bit of evidence right out of the book that kind of supports this theory. So let's jump right into that. So remember, the whole context of this entire story is this is being transcribed by a sailor from the words of a random stranger he supposedly met on the ice, who is relaying these events of his life to him. Okay? So it's not a first-hand account, it's a second-hand account. If he actually found this guy on the ice. So the entire thing has a shadow of doubt hanging over it to begin with. Besides that, after the doc was in university, he gives a time frame for how long he was there before he started digging through graves and doing the heavy anatomy study and decided to actually start putting his monster together. If indeed he did use dead body parts, because I'm still not convinced he did. But if he did, he started that about 2 years, maybe 2.5 years after he got to university. Okay, I get it, we're in the realm of sci-fi / fantasy. But it's really hard for me to believe someone could study books for 2 years and suddenly know how to reanimate the dead. It's a stretch. But both of these points don't even really dig at the meat of why I think the monster isn't real. I think the monster isn't real because, frankly, there's a lot of evidence in the book that says Victor Frankenstein is just balls to the walls insane. Let me read you something. The whole series of my life appeared to me as a dream. I sometimes doubted if indeed it were all true, for it never presented itself to my mind with the force of reality. Victor Frankenstein. Here's another one. How did I cling to their dear forms, as sometimes they haunted even my waking hours, and I persuaded myself that they still lived. Victor, in remembering his friends and family during his final pursuit. I'll just keep tacking on the evidence here. What his feelings were whom I pursued, I cannot know. Sometimes, indeed, he left marks in writing on the barks of trees, or cut in stone that guided me and instigated my fury. My reign is not yet over, the monster left on the stones. These words were legible in one of these inscriptions: "You live, and my power is complete. Follow me. I seek the everlasting ices of the north, where you will feel the misery of cold and frost, to which I am impassive. You will find near this place, if you follow not too tardily, a dead hare. Eat and be refreshed. Come on, my enemy. We have yet to wrestle for our lives, but many hard and miserable hours must you endure until that period shall arrive." I want to dissect that quote a bit, that section from the book. So first of all, Frankenstein's monster hated him with a burning passion. It's why he killed his little brother. It's why he killed his friend. It's why he killed his bride. Okay? Frankenstein's monster hated him. I get that the monster wanted him to suffer. But at the same time, he was so impatient that instead of trying to find humans who would tolerate his existence, he decided to just say screw it after one family and decided to go on a killing spree. This monster isn't exactly portrayed as being the most patient or rational thinking. So, am I really to believe that he delayed his revenge for years while he led the doc on a wild goose chase? I'm skeptical. But then again, the monster is portrayed as patient in other areas, so it's not totally out of the realm of question, but we're wandering off into side points. Another point in this quote that I want to talk about. "Follow me, I seek the everlasting ices of the north, where you will feel the misery of the cold and frost, to which I am impassive." Why would Frankenstein's monster be impervious to the cold, or impassive, as the text says, if it's basically human? Maybe because the monster isn't real? Just a thought. Let's move to the next piece of evidence I have here. He believes that when in dreams he holds converse with his friends and derives from that communion consolation for his miseries or excitements to his vengeance, that they are not the creations of his fancy, but the beings themselves who visit him from the regions of a remote world. This faith gives a solemnity to his reveries that renders them to me almost as imposing and interesting as truth. That's Walton in one of the letters to his sister talking about the doctor. So we have a pretty good idea that the people around Victor, at least at the end, were perceiving him as being not quite all there. And Walton regarded the doctor, by the way, as a dear friend. He loved the guy. He was so happy to have met this guy on the ocean. He regarded him as a true friend. And even Walton was concerned the guy was nuts. Another quote from the book. "Be gone. I will not hear you. There can be no community between you and me. We are enemies. Be gone, or let us try our strength in a fight in which one must fall." Victor Frankenstein to his monster when the monster confronted him. So the reason that last one is relevant is because if you know anything about certain types of mental illness, that's the way people talk to the voices in their head sometimes. And I'm not going to expound on how I know that. Just ask your resident person with mental health issues and they'll tell you, yeah, no, I'm really mean to myself in my head. Shouldn't be laughing. The last point, which is kind of a intertwining point to my little theory that he didn't actually use dead bodies. These two things are kind of interrelated. But if you remember, maybe 10 minutes ago, all the way back near the beginning, I told you that he was on an island with 5 people when he started trying to make the Bride of Frankenstein's monster. So he's out on a remote Scottish island with 5 people, and I'm supposed to believe there was ample dead bodies on that island, or ample materials if he's not ample other materials if he's not using dead bodies to make a whole nother monster. Bullshit. So I think there's a solid case to be made that the monster was never real. The monster is a delusion. I think there's a very real possibility, or at least a lot of evidence, to suggest that maybe Victor Frankenstein killed his friends and family. I think there's evidence to suggest that the entire story is a cautionary tale in delving too deep into the pits of madness, delving too deep into the pits of knowledge. And that is actually kind of backed up by a quote from the Doctor's perspective. Alas, why does man boast of sensibilities superior to those apparent in the brute? It only renders them more necessary beings. If our impulses were confined to hunger, thirst, and desire, we might be nearly free. But now we are moved by every wind that blows, and a chance word or scene that word may convey to us. So, what I take away from that is that the Doctor is philosophizing on the nature of what it is to be human. And he's saying, the beasts of the field do not have the same woes as us. The beasts of the field are free from thought and moral dilemma and such and such and such. Well, it's a long-standing theme in fiction and writing in general, I think, that those who delve too deep into thinking tend to go mad. That's a storytelling device going all the way back to when we first started scribbling stuff down. So, I think that's the bulk of my argument for the monster isn't real theory. But what if I'm wrong? What if we took the book literally? We took Mary Shelley at her word, and the monster was intended to be real. Well, if that is the case, I want to explain why I feel that the monster is not a victim of circumstance. He is not a tragic hero, and he is nothing of the sort like Hollywood often depicts him to be. Frankenstein's monster is a tragic villain, at best. Here's why. So, throughout this book, during the sections where we're mainly with the monster, chapters 11 through 15, we see a lot of the things that influenced him over the course of his development, and things he saw and felt, and his general experience. Remember the flower analogy. She goes into great detail about how people feel and think. So we know the monster, beyond a shadow of a doubt, understands things like joy, love, happiness, compassion. He also has a very good understanding of hate, anger, despair, loneliness, self-loathing. The monster understands these concepts. He has a very good grasp of them. Let me read you something. The poor that stopped at their door were never driven away. I asked, it is true, for greater treasures than a little food or rest. I required kindness and sympathy, but I did not believe myself utterly unworthy of it. Those are the monsters thinking. That's the monster thinking to himself about introducing himself to the people that live in the cottage. And we get from that he definitely understood these emotions, and he knew that all living things required sympathy and compassion and love. Okay? Let me read you another quote. As I read, however, I applied much personally to my own feelings and condition. I found myself similar, yet at the same time strangely unlike to the beings concerning whom I read and to whose conversation I was listening. I sympathized with and partly understood them, but I was uninformed in mind. I was dependent on none and related to none. The path of my departure was free, and there was none to lament my annihilation. My person was hideous, and my stature gigantic. What did this mean? Who was I? What was I? Whence did I come? What was my destination? These questions continually recurred, but I was unable to solve them. That's the monster reflecting internally on both things he's observing from the people who live in the cottage and some stuff that he found in the woods in what amounts to a suitcase and read. And it was stuff like Paradise Lost and other classical works like that. So, great mind fodder. After he left the cottage, after he scared the family away, he gave us this little passage on his journey to Geneva. I generally rested during the day, and traveled only when I was secured by night from the view of man. One morning, however, finding that my path lay through a deep wood, I ventured to continue my journey after the sun had risen. The day, which was one of the first of spring, cheered even me by the loveliness of its sunshine and the balminess of the air. I felt emotions of gentleness and pleasure that had long appeared dead, revived within me. Half surprised by the novelty of these sensations, I allowed myself to be borne away by them, and forgetting my solitude and deformity, dared to be happy. Soft tears again bedewed my cheeks, and even raised my humid eyes with thankfulness towards the blessed sun, which bestowed such joy upon me. We see from this that the monster knows what it is to be happy. We have concrete evidence that he knows what it is to experience joy and good feelings in general, okay? That's important. After that, after he's finished his trip to Geneva, and after he's murdered Victor Frankenstein's brother, his little brother, when he's confronting the doctor, we get this speech. How can I move thee? Will no entreaties cause thee to turn a favorable eye upon thy creature, who implores thy goodness and compassion? Believe me, Frankenstein, I was benevolent. My soul glowed with love and humanity. But am I not alone, miserably alone? You, my creator, abhor me. What hope can I gather from your fellow creatures, who owe me nothing? They spurn and hate me. The desert mountains and dreary glaciers are my refuge. I have wandered here many days. The caves of ice, which I only do not fear, are a dwelling to me, and the only one which man does not grudge. These bleak skies I hail, for they are kinder to me than your fellow beings. If the multitude of mankind knew of my existence, they would do as you do, and arm themselves for my destruction. Shall I not, then, hate them who abhor me? I will keep no terms with my enemies. I am miserable, and they shall share my wretchedness. It is in your power to recompense me, and deliver them from an evil which it only remains for you to make so great, that not only you and your family, but thousands of others shall be swallowed up in the whirlwinds of its rage. Let your compassion be moved, and do not disdain me. Listen to my tale. When you have heard that, abandon or commiserate me, as you shall judge that I deserve. But hear me. The guilty are allowed by human laws, bloody as they are, to speak in their own defense, before they are condemned. Listen to me, Frankenstein. You accuse me of murder, and yet you would, with a satisfied conscience, destroy your own creature. Oh, praise the eternal justice of man. Yet I ask you not to spare me. Listen to me, and then, if you can, and if you will, destroy the work of your hands. So, not only is that a mouthful, but it gives us a very clear idea of what the monster is thinking and feeling, and what his motivations are. And we know, based on that long speech, that he is malicious, that he has made a conscious decision to threaten and kill and coerce and get what he wants by any means necessary. Now, I'm not saying I don't understand his motivation, and I'm not saying I can totally fault him for what he wants, but he knew what it was to be good. He knew what it was to be evil, and he chose to be evil because he was in pain. He chose to do evil things because he wanted a balm from his suffering. I'm not saying that makes him an irredeemable, true evil character, but it does make him a villain. It does make him the bad guy. Sorry, Hollywood. You got that one wrong. So, with those two major points of discussion discussed, I want to hit a few points of general philosophy that are in other places in the book, kind of scattered about, just short quotes that I felt made great points that I wanted to share with you. A human being in perfection ought always to preserve a calm and peaceful mind, and never allow passion or a transitory desire to disturb his tranquility. Victor Frankenstein. But it is not a duty to the survivors that we should refrain from augmenting their unhappiness by an appearance of immoderate grief. It is also a duty owed to yourself, for excessive sorrow prevents improvement or enjoyment or even the discharge of daily usefulness, without which no man is fit for society. Let me repeat the important part there. The discharge of daily usefulness, without which no man is fit for society. Another quick little philosophical point that's kind of apparent in the story is when you look at the fact that Frankenstein abandoned his monster because it was so hideous and so wretched, and the monster proceeded to be his ultimate undoing and cause him untold suffering by killing his friends and family. And the creation of that monster is what Frankenstein had literally spent his whole life striving for prior to doing it. From very early childhood on, he'd been fascinated with the elixir of life, and he determined to do that. To me, that's a very clear instance of the old adage, careful what you wish for, you just might get it. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. I hope I didn't bore you with my long quotes or long rants about the subject matter. And if you enjoyed it, let me know in the comments. Drop me a like. Share it with any of your friends who enjoy classic literature. And I'll see you next time. I shall die, and what I feel now be no longer felt. Soon these burning miseries will be extinct. I shall ascend to my funeral pyre triumphantly and exult in the agony of the torturing flames. The light of that conflagration will fade away. My ashes will be swept into the sea by the winds. My spirit will sleep in peace. Farewell.